Hey, welcome back. Hey, I just want to jump in here real fast before we continue the second part of the truth about tithing. I had recorded originally the first part, and I think it was like an hour and a half long, so I had broke it up just to keep it about an hour per segment. So just jumping in here real fast to let you guys know you can follow along if you go to everlastingcovenant.org/spiritualgiving.pdf. That is the format we're using just to share the scriptures. Everyone can read along and see and follow along. And like I said, the second part of the first video that I recorded is going to go ahead and continue, and then I'll come back for about 30 minutes and try to finish up part two. Again, the basis that we had started with was, and are starting to build an understanding around tithing is food. It's not money. So let's jump right back into it. Thanks. So after the Levites offer the tithe, from that moment, the children of Israel can no longer come near the tabernacle of meeting. Because you got to understand, the Levites are bearing the sin along with the priest, the high priest of Israel. The ministry of the Levites was dedicated ministry, so dedicated they would die if they did not minister it in the dedicated way. It amazes me, it saddens me that the ministry of the Levites and the Levitical priests under Aharon has been so twisted and one-sided to deny its true kodeshah, dedication, of its true meaning. The priests of the Old Covenant were to bear the weight of the sin of Israel and ministry to Yahweh. Now, if we broke down the tithe, we could break it down into three parts. The Levitical tithe, number one. The festival, the celebration of the tithe, number two. And the poor tithe, number three. The Levitical tithe, and I've shared the verses. We don't need to go into the verses. You can go into the verses and read them for yourself, and you should. But if I break this down, the Levitical tithe, the Hebrews were to tithe the seed of the land. These were crops, the fruit of the tree, and of the herd of the flock. They were also to provide for widows and orphans and aliens, and those unable to provide for themselves. This is the other thing that bothered me when I started to study this. In all your teachings, you're not taught to do anything with the widows or the orphans or the aliens. Only a small subset of the church or a church ministry would be doing that, but everybody was commanded to take part in this. It wasn't optional. And there was a system that was prescribed to set up to be able to do this. An offering of the tithes was a ritual meal because it was food in which the Levite was to share in. This is the other thing that bothered me when I studied this. I said, how are we supposed to share in money? Are we supposed to share in money? Are we supposed to take our money and share in it somehow? How are we partaking in this as a ritual, traditional meal? And that should be your first clue. We're talking about food. We're not talking about money. The tithe was given to the descendants of Jacob, Levi's children, for temple work. Levites had no means of income. They had no livelihood. They had no inheritance. They were tithed to, and in return for their service of the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, but they could not keep all 1/10 of the tithe. The Levites offered to Aaron, the high priest, the tithe of the tithe, but it was only every 3 years during the poor tithe. It wasn't every single tithing event. So now this structure that I had built in my mind Okay, the laity tithes to the workers of the ministry tithe to the pastor. Now this is starting to fall apart because the Levites offered to Aaron the tithe of the tithe, but it was only every 3 years. So now I'm trying to figure out, are we supposed to tithe only every 3 years? Well, we got to keep studying. The Levites received first fruits for the priests, the spoils of war, a growth in the number of animals born under their ownership, their tendering, their management, and other offerings. The tithe ceremony, and it was a celebration, a ceremony, required a celebration at the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem, and the tithe was required to be given during the first 2 years. But wait, and years 4 and 5 and of a 7-year cycle. Year 7 being a year of Jubilee. Now, ask yourself, you've been taught Jubilee in Christianity. Where in Jubilee did they talk about the tithe? Oh, they talked about the 7 years. They talked about the Feast of Tabernacles. Where did they talk about the tithe? Why didn't they talk about the tithe? Do they not know? Are they misleading on purpose? How does it make any sense? How come you've never heard of the 7-year cycle of tithing? I never heard of the 7-year cycle of tithing when I wrote this 5 years ago, until I studied it out myself. Years 3 and 6, the tithe was the poor tithe. Why? Because you didn't take your tithe to Jerusalem. Oh, that's the other problem with tithing. You have to take your tithe to Israel, by the way. You can't just give to your church. You have to take it to Israel, to Jerusalem. But in years 3 and 6, you have to leave it in your local storehouse. Oh, you've heard that term before, storehouse? Yeah. Bring all the meat into my storehouse. Right? We're going to get into that. Years 3 and 6, the tithe was for the poor tithe. Remember, I told you it wasn't an option. The fathers, the widows, the orphans. You had to take care of them. It was given locally. Your tithe was given locally to the Levites in the farming communities. Food farming communities. It was for the poor or for the local meeting places. Year 6, the Father said he would command blessing in the 6th year of harvest. And it would provide enough for 3 years. Remember what I told you about Malachi? Yeshua is the key to understanding the book of Malachi. Okay? Yeshua is the key. These numbers are not happenstance. They are not there by chance. They are master architect orchestrated. And when we start to break this down about Yeshua, you're going to come back to this and your mind's going to be blown. Okay, year 6, the Father said he would command blessing in the 6th year of harvest, and it would provide food enough for 3 years, years 7 and years 1 and 2 of the new cycle. Again, tithing was a 7-year cycle. And I guarantee you, 99.9% of you have never heard that. Year 7 was a Shabbat, a Sabbath, and no tithing was required. All had to rest, including the land and Israelites. As a result of the rest during the next 3 years, the Israelites ate the old produce and harvest of the year 6 blessing, then sowed food again in year 1, and the process started over. The festival, the management of the tithes and the offerings. During the annual Feast of Tabernacles, the tribes of Israel traveled to Jerusalem. It was required. While in Jerusalem for a week or so, they celebrated and ate part of their tithe. Tithe was food. I'm paraphrasing it, and I'll have to find the scripture for you, but the Father said, I am not an evil Elohim, that I would pour out blessing on you and not let you partake of it. And I guarantee you've never heard this message before. They went to Israel, and for a week, they celebrated, they ate part of their tithe. Tell me how you could do that with money. Tribes of Israel could also exchange food tithe and offerings for a tithe value. So the value of the tithe plus 20%. Why would they do that? Because some of them had to, or all of them had to go to Israel. And if they were on a long journey, do you want to take 100,000 cattle to Israel? Or 100 cattle, or 10 cattle, or 1 cattle? It doesn't matter. You could exchange that food for money during your journey. So the exchange was only to make the trip easier for some, but once you were at the temple, you had to exchange the money to buy food. At the temple, tithing had to be food. Remember, Yeshua turns over the money changers? And they were basically, the exchange was not fair. And he overthrew the money tables. He's like, you turned my father's house into a house of robbers, a den of robbers and thieves. That's what he's talking about. The local Levites who accompanied each tribe also celebrated and ate. Israel also presented additional offerings, the firstborn, the burnt offerings, the sacrifices, heave offerings, the vowed offerings, the freewill offerings. The tithe, though, had to be shared. It had to be eaten with the Levites, their families. It had to be shared and eaten with the stranger, the fatherless, the widow. And the third part of the tithe is called the third year of the tithe. The tithe every third and sixth year was not brought to Jerusalem, but local cities to supply food for the Levites, the strangers, the fatherless, and widows. Now, one of the common themes that we see in the church taught is the argument of the first. It came from Covenant Church, pastoral leadership. It probably came from somewhere else, but that was the one that made it mainstream. And we have the argument of the first. And in general, if you're so bound by this, you're going to go back to the first and the argument of the first. What we showed earlier outlined all forms of tithing and offerings were some form of food item. It could not be money. There's a reason for this, to provide for the Levites' families, since they were not given land as an inheritance to grow their own food. The issue we run into, though, is some leaders advocate that the first 10% of monetary wages earned from employment are the best parts of our money. See how they twisted the word? I mean, see how sick this is? Should therefore be offered as a tithe. Money is money, food is food. Numbers 18 verse 29 says, of all your gifts you shall offer up every heave offering due to Yahweh, from all the best of them, the consecrated part of them. But look how they took this out of context. If we read Numbers 18, 26 through 28, it's very clear that the heave offering is the 10th of the tithe. 10% of 10%, which is 0.1%, 0.01%. that is considered the best part of the tithe that the Levites offered to Aharon, not the first 10% of the Israelites' food harvest tithe given to the Levites. So seriously, ask yourself, do pastors offer a heave offering to Yahweh today? A tithe of the tithe? The facts are most don't tithe at all. Or they tithe into their own church and are rarely put to the same test as believers to tithe 10%. Now ask yourself, can one even determine the best of the tithe? The first, since money is given, not food now? Not fruit, not grain, not herd, not flock, but money. Money is money. You can't say that the best of my money is the first part of my money because my government gets the first part of my money and then my church gets my tithe. In 99% of the case, unless you have some kind of auto debit, but I guarantee you your work takes out your taxes before you pay your tithes to your church. So how is this even legit? You know, they bring up other arguments around Adam and Eve and the tree of garden, Cain and Abel. They allude to the first and equate to giving, but aren't they themselves a stretch, as they don't even mention the tithe directly? In fact, isn't it ironic that most arguments that the New Testament is only referencing offerings, not tithes? It only states giving. Shaul, who was a Hebrew of Hebrew, he followed this process, guys. Never mentions tithing. He only mentions giving. And he only mentions giving in one simple context. As you have been blessed, give. There's no conditions on it. There's no manipulation of the church. As Yahweh has blessed you, give. If we look at the argument that preachers replaced the Levitical priesthood, again, going back to in my mind logically, okay, the laity, the churchgoers would tithe to the workers of the ministry, the helps ministry, anybody working in the ministry period, and then then we would take the workers of the ministry would take the tithe and give a tenth of that tithe to the pastor or the church leadership. Okay. But the argument is that the preacher, the teacher, the pastor replaced the Levitical priesthood. The argument is that the church replaced the temple. And a lot of times they look at Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12. For the priesthood being changed, there is of necessity a change made also in the law. For the priesthood being changed? Was the priesthood changed? You better believe it. You better believe it. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. So then you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but you are fellow citizens with the Kodesh ones and of the household of Elohim. Remember what I said? We're all one flock now. Often these verses are used to support tithing to the church, and pastors as preachers replaced the Levitical priesthood and modern churches the temple of Elohim. But is this true in Scripture? In proper context, are these scriptures not clear that we, the body of Mashiach, are the new priesthood? All of us? Not just the laity? Not just the workers of the ministry? Not just the pastors? Now consisting of all believers. Our bodies are the new temple of the Ruach HaKodesh, the dedicated spirit of Yahweh. If that's not enough to explain how a modern church is equivalent to a temple, explain to me, how's a modern church equivalent to a temple? When Yeshua said, we are the temple that the Ruach HaKodesh abides in now. How is it the same as the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, where animal sacrifices occurred for the sin of Israel? Doesn't the word say Yeshua and our priesthood are from the order of Melchizedek and not Aharon, which was subject to the Mosaic law? Go back to Hebrews, chapter 7, verse 11 through 17. Now, if there was perfection through the Levitical priesthood, for under that the people have received the law, what further need was there for another Cohen, priest, to arise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aharon? For the priesthood being changed, there is of necessity a change made also in the law? Well, yes, we know this. Yeshua replaces Aharon and Moses. Yeshua replaces the Torah by writing it upon our hearts. For he of whom these things are said belongs to another tribe, from which no one has officiated at the altar. For it is evident that our Mashiach has sprung out of who? Judah, about which tribe Moshe spoke nothing concerning the priesthood. Yet this is yet more abundantly evident if after the likeness of Melchizedek there arises another Cohen, another priest, who has been made not after the law of fleshly commands, but after the power of an endless high life. For it is testified, this is talking about Yeshua, you are a Cohen forever. He is the high priest. He is the Cohen Haggadah of the order of Melchizedek, of the tribe of Judah, not of the order of Aharon under Moses' law, according to the order of Melchizedek. For this is not the right word, for there is a doing away with to create a renewed covenant regarding the commands because of its weakness and uselessness. In other words, you cannot rely on the Torah and following the strict Torah, whether it's written or oral, depending on which way you're coming at it, or both, to gain salvation. Neither will gain you salvation. It is only belief in Yeshua HaMashiach as the Messiah, as the one and only heir of Yahweh. And we know that. It's calling upon the name of Yahweh to be saved. Jeremiah 2:23, we've gone over this many, many times. So, if Yeshua is our priesthood, very specifically our Cohen, who's our pastor? Is this not clear enough for believers today? The pastor did not replace the priesthood. I'll say it again. The pastor, the church leadership did not replace the priesthood. Bottom line, Yeshua himself replaced the priesthood, the Cohen role. You know, we could look at 1 Peter 2:5-9. We could look at 1 Corinthians 3:6, Hosea 1. They're all going to say the same thing of what I just read you about our priesthood. It was the ripping of the veil for the dedicated Ruach to come. It wasn't just symbolic. Okay? It didn't just happen in Scripture. We are the temple, dedicated spirit, and ministers of the renewed covenant. And if you don't understand this, Revelation chapter 1, verse 6, He made us to be a kingdom, priesthood to his Elohim and Father. To him be the esteem and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. He made us to be the priesthood of the kingdom. There is no laity. We are all equal in the kingdom. There will be hierarchy once we are in position, but in terms of our belief system and our way to the Father, we are all equal. There is no priesthood. It is Yeshua HaMashiach who is the top at the priest, as the Kohen Haggadah. That's why you will confess your sins to him, and he will forgive you, just like the priest, the high priest, would take the sins of Israel and ask the Father to forgive the sins of Israel. Okay. Here's another verse, Revelation 5, verse 10. And made them kings and priests to our Elohim, and they reign in the earth. We are all equal. Doesn't mean you can't show respect to your elders. That's really what they are, is elders. But you need to look to the Father and to his word before you look to a pastor who you barely even know. We offer our service of worship to truly the King of Kings, okay, and the Adon of Adons, the Master of Masters, not the Levites or even the Levitical priests, and not to our pastors. If this is true, would we not pay tithes to ourselves as priests? Think about that. If this whole system was set up that way, wouldn't we just pay tithes to ourselves since we're all kings and priests? Do you see how asinine this argument is? Further, have we forgotten that the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, were areas of the temple only the Levitical priests could enter, and that the Israelites were not permitted to go near, as the Levitical priests were mediators between Elohim and the nation of Israel and its people? How can we compare this to our local church building in some manner solely to correlate and even corroborate giving the tithe? The scripture again is clear. Yeshua, Messiah, Mashiach, alone is our mediator, not a pastor or church or leader in ministry. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5. For there's one Elohim, one mediator between Elohim and men. That man is Mashiach. It can't say it any clearer. Hebrews 4, 14 and 16. Having then a great Kohen Haggadah, high priest, who has passed through the Shamayim, Yeshua, the heir of Elohim, let us hold tightly our confession, our belief, for we don't have a high priest, a Kohen Haggadah, who can't be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but one who has been in all points tempted like we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore draw near with boldness to the throne of Mashiach, that we may receive Mashiach, and may find Mashiach and Chana, the pitching of tents, the building of our house, for help in time of need. Again, based on this, how can a preacher equal himself with Messiah, our priest, to now in the modern church be the sole receiver of tithes for all believers and equate themselves only with the Levitical priests, when we are all priests of a different order under Mashiach, Messiah, from the tribe of Judah, Yehuda, not the tribe of Levi. And I showed you at the beginning that Yahweh covenanted with Jacob and his descendants to take care of them forever. And he will. He will. But the simple reality is, you're going to learn this, Israel doesn't tithe. There's no red heifer. There's no temple. They don't tithe. That's going to be restored for a short period of time until Yeshua comes back. He shows them his nail scars and shows them he's the Kohen Hagadol. They don't need to do that anymore. By now, it is our prayer, it's our sincere desire that Yahweh has opened your eyes to some truths that are revealed as plain as day, using only the scripture to teach you the truth. By now, at a minimum, if you will have a heart that is open to the truth of scripture, you should be asking yourself, and pastors, a lot of questions that church leadership is not equipped or prepared to answer, as it is a direct threat to their livelihood. As we continue in this study, we will slowly reveal the Father's plan for giving. It is for you to decide if you will embrace the scripture, all of it, or continue to operate with blinders on, loving the lies you have been fed to build the kingdoms of men, not Elohim. Thank you. Okay, so just jumping right back in here. Deuteronomy 26, we start to learn some really important truths about tithing. The most important thing that we're going to learn is based on Scripture and Scripture alone, what qualified tithing for the people of Israel. And it's super easy. The Father defines it in Deuteronomy 26. You don't have to make anything up. In Deuteronomy chapter 26, it says, "And it shall be when you come into the land which Yahweh your Elohim has given you as an inheritance, and you possess it, and dwell in it, that you shall take some of the first of all the fruits of the land, which you bring from your land, that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you, and shall put it in a basket, and go to the place where Yahweh your Elohim chooses to make his name Yahweh dwell there. And you shall come to the one who is priest, the Cohen, in those days, and say to him, I shall declare today to Yahweh your Elohim that I have come to the land which Yahweh swore to our fathers to give us." And we shared with you in part 1 what this was about. This was the oath that the Hebrew Israelites took as a part of the worship practice for tithing. But what I want to call to your attention, and I'll just share the Blue Letter Bible, Deuteronomy 26, so you can see it's the same. I'll flash that up real quick. But what I want to draw to your attention is this verse, and there's another key verse that defines tithing by the Father. Number 1, what we'll see is that the first of the tithe is the first of some of the fruit of the land. It says, you will take some of the first of the fruit of the land in Deuteronomy 26. Verse 2, that you shall take of the first, or in the Hebrew it says, take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, or the land. So it's an important clue that we want to understand. So it also is referring to, in this case, there's an application of first fruits that we'll learn about, which was also the most choice or the best of the fruit of the land. So naturally, this is talking about seeds. It's not talking about money. So if you're still not convinced, let's keep reading. Possession of the land was a requirement to tithe. So you had to be a descendant of the children of Abraham, very specifically Jacob, Yaakov, and you had to possess the land of Canaan that was given to them in the promised land. We know that that land was promised only to Israel. This is an important point as we build a case against tithing being money, and also understand the requirements to tithe. We can see in Genesis 17, verse 8. Just drop it up here. And I will give to you and your seed after you the land where you are traveling, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their Elohim. Naturally, this is the Father talking to Abraham. So Exodus chapter 6, verse 4 as well. We can look at that. I have also established my covenant with them, Abraham, his children, to give them the land of Canaan and the land of their travels in which they lived as aliens. So we see that possession of the land of Canaan is a requirement. If we look at this closer, we're going to see that you must be a farmer or have agricultural requirements to farm the land in possession. So in order for you to take of the first or some of the fruit of the earth or the land, you had to be a farmer. Next, you had to bring a gift of the land in your possession, meaning you'd have to reap a harvest of food in order to provide the first fruits or the tithe. Next, you must go to the place where Yahweh chooses to place his name. Naturally, we know that this was Jerusalem. We also know that in our previous studies on this, that the Israelites didn't go to Jerusalem every year. The Levites and the Israelites followed a prescribed process in terms of giving, which we outlined in detail. So we had the Hebrews that were going to tithe the seed of the land, which were the crops, the fruit of the tree, the herd of the flock. They would also provide for widows, orphans, and aliens, those unable to provide for themselves. We had the offering of the tithe, which was the ceremonial meal in which the Levites were to share in the tithe with the children of Israel. They would eat it together, given to this. They would have a celebration, a feast for a week in celebration, and they would both partake of their tithe. Another practice that's not followed in modern day giving. You don't get any money back from your tithe. In this scenario, they would be eating their tithe. So given to the descendants of Jacob, of course, for the Levites who work in the temple. Obviously, the Levites had no means of income, livelihood, or inheritance. The Israelites tithed to the Levites, and in return for the work of the service that they provided to the temple and the tent of meeting. But then the Levites could not keep all the tithe. They had to tithe a tenth of that to Aaron and his sons, the priests and the high priest. And the Levites offered to Aaron the tithe of the tithe. But note, it was only every 3 years during the poor tithe. Only every 3 years. This will be an important point as we kind of break this down in more detail and study this out. The Levites received first fruits for the priests. These were spoils of war. This is an important point. The Levites, the priest, the Cohen, or the high priest, would receive spoils of war. This is never talked about in tithing that I've ever heard. It's always in the context of Abraham paying a tithe to Melchizedek, which he did. He didn't pay a tithe. He gave all of the spoils of war to Melchizedek. It's a play on words that they have, ministers have created to get more money from you. So there's a growth in the number of animals born under the Levitical ownership and other offerings, and of course they got to share in that. The tithe ceremony required a celebration. We talked about that. You had to go to Jerusalem, and the tithe was required to be given during the first 2 years, years 4, year 5 of a 7-year cycle in Jerusalem. Year 7 was the year of Jubilee. So years 3 and 6, the tithe was the poor tithe, and that's what we're referring to. It was given locally to the Levites in the farming communities for the poor, or to the local meeting places. So where you've heard, bring all the meat, the tithe, into my storehouse, that's what the Father is talking about. He's not talking about the church. He's talking about bringing the tithe to the local storehouses to provide for the widow, the orphan, and the alien. Year 6, the Father said he would command blessing in the 6th year of harvest, and it would provide enough food for 3 years, years 7 and years 1 and 2 of the new cycle. So it's a 7-year Jubilee cycle. Year 7 was a Shabbat, and no tithe was required. I will repeat that. In year 7, you were not required to give your tithe. All had to rest, including the land and Israelites. As a result of the rest during the next 3 years, the Israelites ate the old produce and harvest of the year 6 blessing. Then they sowed food again in year 1, and the process started over. The festival management of the tithes and offers, we covered that in the last video, but I'm going to jump back to the study. So we see that you had to go to the place where Yahweh chooses to place his name, but that was only certain years. And then you had to go to the priest. You had to go to the priest, meaning you had to take your basket of food, your possession of food, had to go to a Levitical priest, a Levite priest from the tribe of Levi, and declare the Hebrew oath given by Yahweh in offering tithes. And that's what we opened up with. So it's really not a difficult argument that none of these apply to modern day Jews, much less believers in Messiah, since none of these apply to any Gentiles that have come into the kingdom at this time. And I would say at this time because there is scripture, or there is an understanding of giving that we need to understand, but it's not necessarily tithing. And that's what we're going to start to break down. So given all this, where did tithing come from, and why was it passed into the law? And this is kind of how I wanted to start the opening introduction, because in all my years, of being in church and hearing about tithing and being a faithful tither and all that, checking my tithing records and making sure I was giving 10% every year on my total income. So where we end up is, I've never heard ministers talk about Jacob in connection with tithing, and I thought that was strange when I started to study this out. When I was myself challenged with a simple question, could you split your tithe? Could you give your tithe to one church and another church? Just out of a sincere desire to join a group of believers in a church that we really liked and wanted to be a part of. And there was a challenge there that you could not do that. It's interesting. I said, I don't see that in scripture, and I'm going to study it out, And then the Father took me to Genesis 28, and he showed me where tithing originated. And you need to understand this so that you aren't ignorant or taken advantage of. Jacob made a vow to Elohim in Genesis 28. So if we go and read Genesis 28, and I was going to show you that word, sorry. So some of the first of all the produce of the ground which you bring in from your land that Yahweh, your Elohim, gives you. So some of the first that you shall take, some of the first, right here in Hebrew, it's Reshit. And this is where it's talking about the first, beginning, best, chief, or the best part, the choicest part. We'll talk about that in the first fruit offerings that we're above the tithing, free will offerings. So let's read Genesis 28 because we really want to understand this component of tithing that's been left out intentionally, I believe. So Genesis chapter 28, verse 1. And I'm going to read this in the NIV just because I want you to catch some key things, and I don't want you to get hung up on the Hebrew names and places here because they're kind of difficult. So Isaac, Yaakov, that's the son of Abraham. Okay, so we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm sorry, it's the son of Isaac. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Isaac called for Jacob. Yitzhak called for Yaakov and blessed him. He commanded him, do not marry a Canaanite woman. This is a very important clue based on what we know about the history of Israel and their captivity. And we'll come back to this. So go at once to Padam Aram, to the house of your mother's father, Beit El. You know it as Bethel, but it's Beit El, the house of El. Take a wife for yourself there from among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May Elohim Shaddai bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples. May he give you and your descendants the blessing given to Abraham, so that you may take possession of the land where you now reside as a foreigner. So take possession of the land where you now reside as a foreigner, the land Elohim gave to Abraham. Then Isaac sent Yaakov on his way and went to Padam Aram to Laban, son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, who was the mother of Jacob and Esau. Now listen, Esau learned that Isaac had blessed Jacob and had sent him to Padam Aram to take a wife from there. And that when he blessed him, he commanded him, do not marry a Canaanite woman. Do not marry a Canaanite woman. We know this is from the Torah, and the father instructed them. When they go into the land and possess it, that they were not to take the wives of those foreign lands. Now, this is in Genesis. So the Father's already setting them up for this understanding before we get to them going into the land of Canaan later in Exodus, Leviticus, etc. So, do not marry a Canaanite woman, and that Jacob had obeyed his father and mother and had gone to Padam Aram. So Yaakov obeyed, and that's what you need to know. But Esau realized how displeasing the Canaanite women were to his father Isaac. He went to Ishmael and married Mahalath, the sister of Nebaioth and daughter of Ishmael, son of Abraham, in addition to the wives he already had. So what you need to take note of is Esau married a Canaanite woman. Against his father Isaac. Now, clearly this has an impact on Jacob and what we know about obedience, but in particular, the obedience that Jacob was following, as opposed to when we see Israelite taken into captivity because of the kings of Israel doing this exact thing. They were taking wives from, not from the father's people, but from other nations. And it ended up turning the Israelites' hearts to where they began to worship Baal in many different ways. Baal, Asherah, sacrifice on their rooftops to Baal, sacrifice their children to Baal, set up the Asherah poles, the Asherah high places, etc. within Israel. And then the father said, that's it, I'm done. And a good portion of Israel was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, the Babel. And the father was sending them a message because he not only destroyed Solomon's temple, he says in his word in Jeremiah, that he was so mad at them whenever they attacked, he instructed Nebuchadnezzar's army to go into each of those houses that offered Baal worship and incense, and destroy those houses too, and set them on fire. And he was sending a very clear message that disobedience was not going to fly. So Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. And taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels, the Malachim of Elohim, were ascending and descending on it. And there above it stood Yahweh, and he said, I am Yahweh, the Elohim of your father Abraham, the Elohim of Yitzhak. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. I will give you and your descendants. He's talking to Jacob, the son of Isaac. What's he going to give him? The land. Okay? The land. Our argument is that tithing is not and can never be money. I will give you the land. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And we are going to talk about this in another teaching on who is Israel. And probably what I'll do is I'll flash up on the screen a stone that is under a throne in England, in the UK, that the kings bring out. It's an interesting stone. It's an interesting statement that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Because notice what he says. He says they will spread out west, east, north to south. We're going to talk about that in more detail, and try to unravel some of these clues that he's sharing here. Says, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Now, when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely Yahweh is in this place, and I was not aware of it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of Elohim. This is the gate of the heavens, the Shamayim. And then early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Beth El. It's Beit El, so house of Elohim. Though the city used to be called Lutz. I think it's almond tree in Hebrew is Lutz. Now, listen. Jacob made a vow. What did he say? He said, if Elohim will be with me and will watch over me on this journey, I am taking and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's household. Then the Elohim, Yahweh Elohim, will be my Elohim, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be Elohim's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. This is really important. This is before the law. So I will give you a tenth of all that you give me. So what we see is that Jacob made a vow to Elohim in Genesis 28. He said, of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Here's the thing, though. Jacob never gave the tithe or a tenth. You could say he really wasn't capable of giving a tithe. There's a reason for that. The reality is Jacob ended up giving the tithe or a tenth through his children. So you also see the biblical reason why Israel could only tithe from agriculture and livestock. It's because, again, going back to the promise that the father would give him the land where he had his head on the pillar, on the stone. And so you would also learn, we will also learn why they could only tithe from the produce of the promised land. You will also see why the Levites were not given an inheritance as promised by Elohim, but ironically were given the tithe of the land. So Jacob had just woken up from a dream where Elohim promises Jacob, the land on which you are lying, I give it to you and your seed. And in response, Jacob vows, of all that you give me, I shall certainly give a tenth to you. So Jacob made a vow to give a tenth from the land that Elohim promised to give him and his descendants. Jacob's vow was not a general statement that included a tithe from his wealth or from his occupation or any gold or silver. It was a promise to give Elohim back 10% of the increase from the land of Canaan. Strangely, Jacob never received the promised land, so there was never an opportunity for him to tithe, and that's what we mean by that. So, as we all know, the descendants of Jacob eventually did receive the promised land. His descendants did. They received the promised land, which provided them an opportunity to fulfill the promise of their father by tithing off of the seed of the land and of the fruit of the tree. That's why we say this is not in the law per se. It was added as it was a covenant that Jacob made with Elohim, and Elohim made covenant with Jacob. And we'll learn, you're going to learn, I've talked about this, that covenant is for eternity. It did not pass, it has not passed just because Israel doesn't tithe any longer because there's no temple. That covenant is still in effect. Yahweh will be Jacob and his descendants, the Levites, the tribe of Levi. He will be their inheritance forever. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, belongs to Yahweh. It is Kodesh to Yahweh. We see this in Leviticus 27, 30 through 34. And I included this verse because it is the most definitive verse in the scripture about tithing. Okay? All of the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is Yahweh's. It is Kodesh to Yahweh. So not only in Leviticus 27 verse 30 does the Father talk about tithing, but he defines it. Right? We see in Leviticus 27 verse 30, and all the tithe of the land. Now in the Hebrew, all they do is they put a dash, and then they say of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree. But what's happening is the statement by the Father is defining what that tithe is. He says, of the tithe of the land, the tithe of the land is the seed of the land and the fruit of the tree of the land. And it belongs to Yahweh. He's telling them, it is Kodesh to Yahweh. Again, we see Yahweh implicitly defines, he qualifies what the tithe is, including seed of the land, fruit of the tree. And sadly, it seems logical that based on this verse alone, Yahweh's scripture cannot be added to in order to justify money as a tithe. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2, you should not add to the word which I am commanding you, nor take away from the word which I am commanding you. So in Deuteronomy 1:8, it states, see, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which Yahweh swore to your fathers, to who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To what? Give them and their descendants after them. What? The land. The covenant in Psalm 105, verse 6 and 7, the covenant states he made a covenant with Abraham, an oath to Isaac, and confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel for an everlasting covenant, saying to you, I will give the land of Canaan as the allotment of your inheritance. We see this in Numbers 18, verse 21. And behold, I have given the children of Levi, all the 10th in Israel for an inheritance. That's the tithe, for their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. We see clearly Yahweh gave all the tithe to the children of Levi, Jacob's sons and daughters. Jacob's sons and daughters, his descendants. And clearly from these verses, we can unequivocally say no modern day pastor or church leader has a right to the tithe. Yahweh covenanted with Jacob. Jacob covenanted with Yahweh. And he said, of all that you give me, I will give a tenth. Jacob's children upheld that covenant. Or did they? Because that's where we start to see things fall apart in Malachi chapter 3. Very specifically, but in the book of Malachi, setting this up, that no, at one point, they had stopped giving. But the point being, a modern day pastor or church leader, number one, they can't prove that they're from the tribe of Levi. And number two, they don't have, without that, without the land, without living in the land, on and on and on, the requirements that we just laid out, they have no right to the tithe. That's the first argument. The other arguments we'll get into in terms of how the tithing system was set up. And you'll start to see the error of the way that this has been taught. So knowing these truths, let's begin to unpack the lies that have been told believers about tithing. So when we talk about first fruits and tithing, are they the same? Proverbs 3 verse 9 states, honor Yahweh with your possessions and the first fruits of all your increase. Ministers have taken this verse completely out of context. Completely out of context. And I'll show you why, because the key here is first fruits of all your increase. This is a free will. First fruits are a free will offering. But are possessions only money? Israelites, in addition to the food tithe, gave special giving of offerings of various types, like fine choice crops and fruits. We see this in Deuteronomy 16:10, 26 verse 1 through 4. So it's important to note first fruits were free will offerings, separate but required offerings as a specific food tithe. Food tithe. Again, Scripture defines this for us. You can't say that the first fruits of all your increase includes money because it was a food tithe. Also contrast that tithes were paid to Levites, the fatherless, the stranger, and the widow, whereas first fruits were given to who? Levitical priests under Aaron. So it's really important to note that all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. Interestingly enough, we can clearly see both first fruits and tithes are food, not money, as we continue to study this. So ask yourself, if the Israelites gave their tithe to Levites, the priests, and the first fruits to the high priest under Aaron, wouldn't we only need to give a tenth of the tenth to the tithe? To tithe? Since according to Scripture, we're all kings and priests now. The same as the Levites. And the Levites, not Israelites, were required to pay a tithe of the tithe to the priests, not first fruits. I'll say that again. The Levites, the priests, doing the temple worship, doing the work of the ministry, not the Israelites growing the food for the Levites. The Levites were required to pay a tithe of the tithe, so a tenth of the tenth, to Aaron and his sons, the priests, high priest, but not first fruits. So ask yourself again, who are pastors representing to receive the tithe? Israel, who gave the tithe to the Levites, and the first fruits to the high priests. The Levites who received the 10% tithe from the 11 tribes of Israel for food for them. The Levitical priests who received a tenth of the tenth, every 3 years in first fruits. Or could it be that the Messianic priesthood under Melchizedek priesthood not required to tithe at all? Which one? And this is probably a good place to stop here, and we'll continue in part 3. But you know, I knew something was off whenever I started to hear this phrase. Most pastors assume the role of all three in terms of the suggestion that 1, 2, or 3 in that list is correct. But they completely turn a blind eye to the fourth, suggesting that we're all kings and priests. There is no laity. There's only kings and priests within the kingdom. We're all equal. But how can that be scriptural if Yeshua is our high priest? Meaning, how can it be scriptural that Israel, a churchgoer, for example, that doesn't work in ministry, how could it be scriptural that they should pay their tithe to the pastor who represents the priests or the workers in the ministry, and in some cases the high priest, Aaron and his sons, offering the sins for Israel themselves? Well, we know that this is ludicrous. It's asinine because Yeshua is our high priest now. He's the only one who offered through his blood the remission, the complete remission of sin for all of mankind, for all that would believe, accept, and follow the way, the Torah, and the loving instruction of the Father, and believe in the work that Yeshua did as his one and only heir. So, most pastors don't tithe. Now think about this. Most pastors don't tithe. And even the ones that do tithe, I guarantee you, they will tithe into their own ministry. So let me ask you a question. Are they now robbing Elohim?